segment were various pots, which looked like real ceramic pots containing dwarf fruit trees. The soft clanking of the heavy void boots against the flooring panels echoed softly against the water flowing beneath them, though it couldn't be heard unless one was completely silent. There was a constant flow of water running through the plants, into the floor, and through a well-maintained system on pumps, filters, and processing systems. Though the water channel directly under their feet was kept of macroorganisms, there were thousands of gallons of dedicated aquatic habitats. Mick had made the best of some boring nights, fishing in one habitat under a particularly fragrant cherry tree. As Mick went to turn down a corridor connecting this ring to next, Sarah grabbed his shoulder firmly to stop him in his tracks and force him to face her. Though the gesture was not particularly gentle, it wasn't going to hurt Mick in any way and had the desired effect of pulling his undivided attention. "So what are we going to tell them?" she asked, in a very slow, clear tone, to make sure that he knew she wasn't really asking anymore. She was demanding. "We tell them the truth. That the humans of the Sol system are currently in a state of Cold War between the Earth's sphere of influence and the independent stations and colonies outside of that influence." Mick spoke in an equally slow and clear tone. He could tell now that she really didn't understand what he was trying to get at earlier. They probably already know all about our drama back home. Or, if they don't, I'm sure they can just send someone to go check it out and see what's going on. We, you and me, need to just tell them that neither of us are really qualified for a real diplomatic mission, but we would both love to make the appropriate connections once we get back home. You to your government, and me to mine, and we're both good. Maybe they'll even give us a ride and we'll get to check out a real alien spaceship. As Sarah ran through that scenario in her head, she had to admit it was the sensible thing she could think of. She let go of Mick's shoulder and let him continue leading the way through the ship, though she did try to get more out of him. She really did want to make a better plan than simply passing the ball off to someone and hoping these completely unknowns would simply be nice. At the very least, this would likely cost something, and she was concerned as to what the price would be. However, before she could articulate that thought, Mick came to a stop in front of a large locked cabinet with the word guns crudely spray painted on it. "All right, we're going to need to grab you something. You still prefer Temnem? Or have you moved on to something more modern yet?" Mick said, while fumbling with the lock and opening the cabinet. "I swear to all that is holy, you have a problem, Mick." Sarah stared at what could only be described as a pile of firearms, energy-based weapons, and even a few stylized melee implements. "I know. I need a bigger cabinet." "Now, what do you want?" Reading the instructions they sent over, they seem to be totally cool with sidearms, just not stuff that can punch holes in hulls. Reaching into his own jacket and pulling out a few cylinders of cartridges, he placed them in a cubby attached to a door of the cabin. "Seriously, though, grab something and throw some non-lethals in it." Stepping back from the cabinet to give her more room to see the selection, Mick didn't seem even slightly concerned about the possibility of Sarah shooting him with the gun he was about to give her. As Sarah stepped forward to find something appropriate, she would have been lying to herself if she said the thought hadn't crossed her mind. With the weight of their shared situation, the thought was fleeting. She could stab him in the back once they got back to Earth. Picking up a Temne service pistol nearly identical to the one she had left behind in the transitor module, Sarah held it up for examination. Nitmina. I knew it. Mick snorted out with laughter, before reaching out with a holster that matched the pistol in Sarah's hand. Realizing that he had grabbed the holster before she had picked out the gun almost made her want to put it back. Instead, she snatched the holster out of Mick's hand while giving him an angsty look. She had the same preference of handgun for over 10 years, and it seemed Mick hadn't forgotten the exact model and color pattern. The urge to break her facade of an uncaring spy was so strong that couldn't bring herself to say anything at all out of fear it may slip. Anyways, Mick held a slight smile on his face. We got a meeting with some aliens. Oh, yeah, left hand. The smoke from the fainting burning bowl slowly rose and mixed with still lingering clouds in a hypnotic dance. The individual smoke trails would twist together and pull apart as they were affected by the subtle air currents caused by Tenz's breath and the atmosphere circulation system. With the main lighting dimmed and the various accent and accessory lighting creating thin pillars of color, the ballet completely controlled Tenz's attention. It had been close to 18 hours of confinement to his quarters, and he was trying to avoid thinking about anything by focusing on nothing. The clouds of smoke from this particularly potent mixture helped clear his mind despite the way it fogged the room. He didn't want to risk allowing his mind to wander too far and create unrealistic fantasies, be they beautiful or terrible. All he knew is that his species had finally ascended beyond the shackles of their mother planet's tight embrace and broke the light speed barrier. However, the longer he heard nothing, the more that empty space scared him. The sudden dinging of his door notification and lighting up of the display was enough to grab his attention, but not enough to startle him. As his eyes slowly focused on the relatively small screen, he could see Axika standing at his door with her arms folded and two of her fingers tapping on her large bicep in a fluid but reserved motion. Tenz moved towards the panel below the display and simultaneously pressed the intercom and atmospheric circulation button at the same time. Hold on a minute. I gotta vent some smoke. Tenz calmly spoke at the display. I don't want to give you a head change if you're on duty. Just open the door, please. Axika turned her head to face directly into the camera lens. Though her expression was sharp and stern, as it always was when she was on duty, Tenz could see something off in her crimson-red eyes. In the 10 years he had known her, he had never heard her use the word please this earnestly. A quick dance of fingers and the room lighting returned to normal level. The air began to circulate a bit fast, and the door slowly slid open. Taking 2 full steps back so Axika's bulky frame could enter the room, Tenz couldn't help but let his mind start to race as a large blue woman stepped into the room, and the door slid closed behind her. Her once rigid expression and cutting features seemed to all melt, as it looked like she was about to cry. We need to talk. It was as if something was stuck in her throat as she said those words. She seemed almost empty as gently grazed up against Tenz's body as she walked over to his bed and sat down near the foot. Following her lead, walked over and sat down on his bed a bit closer towards the head. As his rear end planted itself into the bedding, Axika gently fell over and placed her head in his lap. Not wanting his anxiety to push any unnecessary pressure on her, he refrained from saying anything. Instead, he gently stroked her thick reddish-orange braids with loving intent. You know, I would never keep anything from you, right? The question was earnest, and came from Axika's heart. Well, Ten started with a slight laugh. I know you would never keep anything from me that I thought I would need to know. This response was what Axika was expecting, but Tens didn't seem to understand the context of the question. Even though he had learned her language years ago, there were still some subtleties he would miss. Taking a deep breath, not wanting the comfort of her current position to end, she slowly pulled herself up from Tens's lap. Shifting her position so she could directly face Tens, she closed her eyes for a moment and took another deep breath. It's not like that. Axika was trying to figure out where to begin. She was starting to get lost in her own thoughts. Suddenly, she felt her hand being embraced by Tens's, the two locked eyes. Just pick anywhere to start, and we'll figure it out as we go. Tens's tone and demeanor were as serene as he could muster, given his own mental turmoil. I just got out of an hour-long meeting with my matriarch, the Grand Matriarch, and some meek and xenobiology I had only ever heard. She paused for a moment to collect her thoughts again, but unintentionally left room for Tens to ask a question. Did something bad happen during the first contact meeting? Tens knew he could have waited just a moment and gotten the answer, but his anxiety was at its peak. No. I mean, nothing bad happened. And from Tarki and Miyakorva's report, even Nan's questions didn't really cause any problems. It's just... She trailed off again. Wait, Nan's here? When did they get here? Fucker still owes me a new mag sling. Tense was now starting to go in a less than positive direction, so he had to make a joke about how the robot had borrowed, but never returned, one of his favorite weapons. If an entity of this singularity was here, something major was happening. First contact with a species who had just left their solar system is a significant and rare occurrence in which participation is not only coveted, but highly rewarded by the Galactic Community Council. A species as well-respected, diplomatic, and independently capable as the Quastar should not need any sort of help. They should simply be able to follow the predetermined guidelines without the very people who wrote those guidelines in the room with them. If Nan was here, the singularity had decided to get personally involved. Tens assumed it must have had something to do with whatever had destroyed the Devourer mass, though he couldn't guess as to why Nan had personally come out here. Nan was a cultural and xenobiological who had made a home for himself in Shkegpiwin, the Nishnabee capital city. The fact Nan was now a few thousand light years away from home within 18 hours gave Tens a bad feeling. Nan is here for a few reasons, but I'm sure you'll end up running into him soon. He's working out some sort of deal with the captain of that weird little ship, but that's not what's important. Akshika had finally collected her thoughts into a coherent train of thought. Pulling out her display tablet, she brought up the video footage of the initial first contact interview. Wait, Lola? Though she had stopped speaking long enough for Tens to ask any question, he remained silent, so she continued. I'm going to start this a few minutes after Nan began discussing the potential existence of a... She paused to try to remember how to pronounce the word correctly. Human population that had been abducted and was now a respected member of the community. They seemed to take the thought exercise surprisingly up until the male asked where the theoretical abducted people had come from. I think he knew it wasn't just theoretical or a thought exercise. Well, it would be better Just to show you. Moving from where she was seated, Axika scooted across the bed and repositioned herself so she could lean against the wall. She held the display tablet in one hand and raised the other arm as an invitation for accepting the invitation and moving to cuddle up next to her. Tens found himself in a strong but comfortable embrace. As he reached forward and pressed the play button on the display, he could finally see what had gotten Axika so worked up. On the screen were three personally familiar, yet quite alien figures sat on the other side of a table from two quite foreign figures who, despite noticeable differences, could have been his cousins. It was easy to recognize Binko's wife Tarki, with her vibrant gold and tan feathers, fainting, glowing blue eyes, and sapphire emblazoned jewelry. Mia Korva, the Quiztar diplomacy officer in training, was also easy to recognize with her relatively soft features, not as large stature, and dyed red and purple hair. Even Nan, despite his semi-liquid mutable form, was easy to recognize in the somewhat humanoid form he became fond of over the years with humans. Of the two humans, the one that looked the most different was a fairly tall and well-built woman with vibrant red hair and deathly pale skin. Though it was quite obvious by how healthy her form and features were that she was not ill in any way, Tens was concerned by that skin tone. The only people he had ever seen who looked quite that light were either dead, dying, or had some sort of rare condition, such as albinism. Her hair color, he assumed, couldn't have naturally been that color and must have been dyed in a way similar to Mia Korva's hair. If it weren't for her deep emerald eyes, speckling of freckles, and faintest hints of suntan, Tens would have simply assumed she was an albino with dyed hair. The man seated next to her, however, had a darkest complexion and features vaguely reminiscent of some of the people from the Tens home. He was, much like the woman, of a noticeably lighter complexion than Tens. Though that wasn't necessarily uncommon. Tens wasn't the darkest Nishnab he knew, but he always wasn't the lightest. This man also seemed to have a similar build to Tens, though slightly taller and a bit bulkier, a fact which was being exaggerated by the oversized red jacket he was wearing. If the two men were this similar, Tens knew the man would be quite popular with many of the women on board, despite his strange fashion choices and the prominent web pattern markings around his left eye. As the recording started to play, Tens noticed a large projection of a planet with a red area, highlighted between some large lakes and the eastern coast of a continent. It seemed Nan had just finished explaining something to the human man, as it looked like there was a slight smile in question hanging from his lip. As the sound of the man's voice began playing through the display's speakers, Tens immediately recognized that this wasn't his language, nor any language he was familiar with. As the disjointed combinations of sounds began filtering through Tens's translator, he could tell the man was very much aware of the context of the conversation taking place. From right here. 1,200 years ago? 150 people abducted, and there's 750 million now. And what do these people call themselves? Mick had hoped that last question would let the alien maid of flowing metal get the hint that Mick knew what this conversation was really about. Well, in this hypothetical, the biomechanical being was cut by a loud slam as Mick slapped the table with his right palm and left a slight imprint in the metal. In a motion so fast and smooth the recording device couldn't properly capture it, Mick's right hand pointed an accusatory finger at the alien being and reached to his hip with his left. Everyone else in the room froze and stared at the man. Hypothetical is over. No more games. Like, You seem like a real cool